Hi, I'm Dr. Claire Thompson. For 32 years, my father told me I was chasing fantasies, wasting my life on books instead of doing real work. Last Saturday at his birthday dinner, he called me worthless in front of our entire family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 20 minutes later, his heart stopped beating, and the woman who saved his life turned to me and said, "Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Your emergency protocol saved my husband last month." Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of timing. The afternoon light streaming through the windows of Riverside Steakhouse felt different that day, heavier somehow, like it knew what was coming. I smoothed down my navy dress, the one I'd chosen specifically because it wasn't too formal, wasn't too casual, wouldn't give my father another reason to comment on how I was either trying too hard or not trying hard enough. David squeezed my hand as we walked through the restaurant's entrance, past the mounted fish and vintage photographs of Portland's logging history that my father always pointed out with pride. The reservation was for 6 people, a small gathering, for Robert Thompson's 68th birthday. Nothing elaborate, just family, the way he preferred it. My mother Linda had called 3 weeks earlier to coordinate, her voice carrying that familiar tone of careful orchestration she used when she wanted to avoid conflict. "Claire, honey, you know how your father gets about big productions. Let's keep it simple." Simple. That word had followed me my entire life, used to describe everything from my childhood birthday parties to my career choices, always delivered with the implication that I was the one making things unnecessarily complicated. I spotted them immediately at the corner booth, the same spot where we'd celebrated every family milestone for the past 15 years. My father sat with his back to the wall, surveying the room like he owned it, his weathered hands already wrapped around a beer bottle. 43 years of construction work had carved lines into his face that spoke of early mornings and physical labor, and he wore those lines like badges of honor. My mother sat beside him, her graying hair perfectly styled, her smile brightening, when she saw us approaching. Marcus, my younger brother, was already there with his wife Jennifer, their 2 kids coloring on paper placemats with the restaurant's crayons. "There's our girl," my mother said, standing to embrace me. The hug lingered a moment longer than usual, and I wondered if she sensed the tension I'd been carrying for weeks. David shook hands with my father, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the Trailblazers' latest losing streak. Marcus nodded at me from across the table, his attention quickly returning to his phone where he was probably checking stock prices or responding to work emails. At 30, he'd already made partner at a commercial real estate firm, the kind of success that translated easily into dinner table conversation. "Claire's been putting in crazy hours at the hospital," David offered as we settled into our seats. 18-hour shifts, sometimes more. My father's eyes flicked toward me briefly. "Must be nice to have a job where you can sit around all day." The comment landed like it always did, casual and cutting. I'd heard variations of it countless times over the years. Doctors don't do real work. Doctors just talk and write prescriptions. Doctors make money off other people's pain. The fact that I spent most of my shifts on my feet, moving between trauma bays and cardiac units, managing life and death situations, never seemed to register. In my father's world, real work left you physically exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, with calloused hands and aching muscles. Everything else was just playing pretend. "She saved 3 lives last week," David continued, his voice steady but protective, "including a construction worker who fell from scaffolding." My father's expression didn't change. Anyone can follow a manual. The server appeared then, a young woman with a bright smile who took our drink orders and handed out menus. The interruption provided a momentary buffer, allowing us to retreat into the safe territory of food choices and small talk about the restaurant's new appetizers. Marcus talked about a commercial property deal he was closing, his words flowing easily, As he described square footage and profit margins, Jennifer shared updates about the kids' soccer seasons and school projects. The conversation moved around me like water around a stone, natural and unforced, until inevitably it circled back to careers and achievements. Marcus just got promoted again, my mother said, her pride evident. Regional director now, youngest, in the company's history. That's fantastic, I said, and I meant it. Marcus had always been driven, ambitious in ways that made sense to our family. His success was tangible, measurable in salary increases and office sizes and company cars. What about you, Claire? Jennifer asked. Any exciting news from the hospital? I hesitated, knowing that sharing my recent achievements would likely invite more dismissive comments from my father. But David's encouraging nod gave me courage. I was selected for the Cardiac Surgery Fellowship at Oregon Health Sciences. It's a pretty competitive program. Surgery? My mother's eyebrows rose. I thought you were happy in emergency medicine. I am, but this is a chance to specialize further. The fellowship would mean 2 more years of training, but after that, I'd be qualified to perform complex heart surgeries. It's something I've wanted since medical school. My father set down his beer with more force than necessary. More school. Of course, can't just be satisfied with what you have. It's not just school, Dad. It's advanced training in life-saving procedures. Heart surgery requires years of specialized education and practice. Everything requires years of specialized education with you people, he said, the phrase you people hanging in the air like smoke. Marcus learned on the job, got results, made something of himself without hiding behind books for half his life. The familiar heat rose in my chest, the frustration I'd felt countless times before when my accomplishments were dismissed or diminished. 8 years of medical school and residency, board certifications, hundreds of patients whose lives I'd directly impacted, none of it seemed to matter because it didn't fit his definition of valuable work. Claire's not hiding behind anything, David said, his voice carrying an edge. She's one of the most respected emergency physicians in the city. Her colleagues nominated her for the fellowship because of her skill and dedication. My father's laugh was harsh. Respected by who? Other people who've never done a real day's work? You can get all the fancy titles you want, but at the end of the day, you're just another person who thinks they're better than the rest of us. The words stung because they revealed something I'd suspected for years but never wanted to acknowledge. In my father's mind, my education wasn't an achievement to be celebrated. It was evidence of betrayal, proof that I thought I was above the family I came from. Every degree I earned, every professional milestone I reached, widened the gap between us rather than bridging it. That's not fair, Robert, my mother said quietly. Claire works very hard. Hard? He turned to look at me directly. You want to know what hard work is? Getting up at 5 in the morning to frame houses in the rain. Spending 12 hours on your feet pouring concrete. Coming home so tired you can barely move, but doing it again the next day because that's what it takes to provide for your family. That's hard work. What you do is just expensive guessing. The restaurant noise seemed to fade around us. Other families were laughing at nearby tables, celebrating their own milestones and achievements, oblivious to the tension unfolding in our corner booth. Marcus was studying his menu intently, avoiding eye contact. Jennifer was focused on helping. The kids with their coloring. My mother's face had taken on the carefully neutral expression she wore when she wanted to avoid conflict. Dad, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I've spent the last decade learning how to save people's lives. Last month alone, I helped deliver emergency care to over 200 patients. Some of them would have died without immediate medical intervention. And how many of them would have lived anyway? How many times do you actually make a difference versus just taking credit for what would have happened regardless? The question felt like a physical blow. It struck at every insecurity I'd ever had about my career. Every moment I'd wondered if I'd chosen the right path. Every patient I'd lost despite my best efforts. The doubt that lived quietly in the back of my mind. The fear that maybe I was just an educated fraud suddenly had a voice, and it sounded exactly like my father. "Claire makes a difference every single day," David said firmly. "She saved lives, prevented complications, provided comfort to families during their worst moments. That's not guessing. That's skilled medical practice." My father's expression hardened. "You're both living in a fantasy." She's 32 years old, still playing student, still pretending that reading books makes her special. Meanwhile, Marcus has a house, a family, a real career that actually contributes something to the world. "Medicine doesn't contribute to the world?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "Not the way you practice it, sitting in your ivory tower, charging people thousands of dollars to tell them things they could figure out themselves. You want to help people? Become a nurse. Do something useful instead of chasing titles and prestige." The suggestion that I should have become a nurse instead of a doctor wasn't just about career choices. It was about knowing my place, staying in a role that my father considered more appropriate for someone from our background. The comment revealed his belief that I'd overreached, that I'd aimed for something beyond what I deserved or was capable of achieving. Marcus finally looked up from his menu. "Can we just order? The kids are getting restless." His intervention was meant to de-escalate, but it also felt like an abandonment. Throughout our childhood, Marcus had been my ally, the one person who understood what it was like to navigate our father's expectations and criticisms. But somewhere along the way, as he'd found success in ways that our father approved of, that alliance had shifted. Now he seemed more interested in avoiding conflict than defending me. The server returned, and we placed our orders in strained politeness. My father ordered the largest steak on the menu, as he always did, making jokes with the server about his appetite and his ability to finish what other people couldn't. The normalcy of the interaction felt jarring after the intensity of our conversation, like watching someone flip a switch between hostility and charm. As we waited for our food, the conversation drifted to safer topics. The weather, local news, plans for the upcoming holidays. But the tension remained, sitting heavy between us like an uninvited guest. I found myself watching my father's face, searching for any sign of pride or approval, any indication that beneath his criticism was love or respect for what I'd accomplished. Instead, I saw the same expression I'd grown up with, the mixture of disappointment and dismissal that had shaped so many of our interactions over the years. Our meals arrived, and we ate with the kind of forced civility that families perfect, when they'd rather be anywhere else. My father dominated the conversation, telling stories about his latest construction projects, complaining about regulations and safety requirements that made his job more difficult. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus nodded along, occasionally contributing his own complaints about real estate regulations and difficult clients. The two of them found common ground in their shared frustration with bureaucracy and oversight, bonding over their roles as practical men dealing with impractical systems. I listened, feeling increasingly like an observer rather than a participant. This was the dynamic I'd grown up with, the sense that my interests and achievements existed in a separate world from theirs, a world they viewed with suspicion and resentment. Every attempt I made to contribute to the conversation felt forced. Every story I told about my work met with polite disinterest or subtle criticism. As we finished our main courses and the server cleared our plates, my father raised his beer in a toast. "To another year of keeping it real," he said, his eyes scanning the table. "To family that sticks together and doesn't forget where they came from." The words were clearly directed at me, a reminder that in his view, I'd forgotten my roots, abandoned the values I'd been raised with in pursuit of something he considered artificial and pretentious. I raised my water glass mechanically, going through the motions of the toast while feeling the weight of his judgment. But as the evening wore on, I realized something was shifting inside me. The familiar shame and frustration were still there, but they were being joined by something else, a quiet anger, not just at my father's words, but at my own acceptance of them. For years, I'd internalized his criticism, allowed his definition of worth and value to influence how I saw myself and my career. I'd spent countless hours questioning my choices, wondering if he might be right, if I really was just an educated fraud playing at being important. Sitting in that restaurant, surrounded by my family but feeling completely alone, I began to see the situation more clearly. My father's criticism wasn't really about my career or my abilities. It was about his own insecurities, his fear that my success somehow diminished his worth or challenged his worldview. His need to belittle my achievements said more about him than it did about me. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it freed me from the burden of trying to earn approval that would never come. Heartbreaking because it meant accepting that my father might never be able to see or celebrate who I'd become. The little girl who had once desperately wanted her daddy's pride was finally beginning to understand that his inability to give it wasn't her fault. The dessert menu came and went without much fanfare. My father ordered his usual chocolate cake, extra whipped cream, while the rest of us passed on sweets. The sugar crash from earlier emotions had left me feeling hollow, like I'd been running on empty for hours. As we sat there in the aftermath of dinner, I found my mind wandering back through the years, connecting dots I'd never wanted to see clearly before. There was the time in high school when I'd won the state science fair with a project on cardiac arrhythmias. I'd spent months researching, building models, interviewing local cardiologists who were impressed enough to write recommendation letters for my college applications. The day of the awards ceremony, my father had to work late. "Can't leave the job site," he'd told me that morning. "Concrete doesn't wait for school ceremonies." My mother attended, took pictures, cheered when my name was called. But that night, at dinner, when I excitedly described the judge's feedback and the scholarship opportunities the win had opened up, my father barely looked up from his plate. "Don't let it go to your head," was all he said. College had been a series of similar moments. Dean's list every semester, but grades don't mean much in the real world. Acceptance into pre-med programs, but you sure you want to rack up all that debt? Even my MCAT scores, which placed me in the 95th percentile, were met with a shrug and a comment about how test-taking isn't the same as real knowledge. Each achievement felt like shouting into a void, my excitement met with indifference or subtle discouragement. Medical school had been the worst. The financial strain was enormous, even with scholarships and student loans. I'd worked part-time jobs throughout my undergraduate years, saving every penny, but medical school expenses were overwhelming. My parents helped Marcus with his down payment on his first house during this same period, a $20,000 gift that they called an investment in his future. When I'd mentioned my own financial struggles, needing money for board exam fees and medical equipment, my father had suggested I reconsider whether this whole doctor thing is really worth it. The memory that hurt most was from my medical school graduation. 4 years of 18-hour study days, clinical rotations that left me exhausted and emotionally drained, exams that determined not just my grades but my entire future career path. I'd graduated in the top 10% of my class, matched into a competitive emergency medicine residency program, achieved everything I'd dreamed of since I was 16 years old, and shadowed Dr. Patricia Kim at Portland General Hospital. Nth of I. Graduation ceremony was held at Portland State University's auditorium, a grand space filled with families celebrating their children's accomplishments. I'd saved seats for my parents, Marcus and David, who was still my boyfriend then but had already started talking about marriage. As the ceremony began and names were called, I watched other families erupting in cheers, holding signs, taking photos. When my name was announced and I walked across the stage to receive my degree, I heard David whooping from the audience, saw my mother standing and clapping. My father remained seated, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. After the ceremony, families gathered on the lawn for photos and celebrations. Other graduates were surrounded by relatives, their parents beaming with pride, talking to anyone who would listen about their doctor, daughter, or son. My mother hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, honey. Dr. Thompson. It has such a nice ring to it." David lifted me off my feet in a bear hug, spinning me around while I laughed. Even Marcus seemed genuinely happy, shaking my hand and calling me sis with unusual warmth. My father shook my hand. That was it. A brief, formal handshake like I was a business associate he'd just met. "Congratulations," he said, the word delivered without emotion. When relatives approached to congratulate our family, he'd nod politely, but didn't volunteer information about my achievement. While other parents were bragging about their children's accomplishments, my father talked about the weather, about construction projects, about anything except the fact that his daughter had just become a doctor. The residency years had been brutal in ways that people outside medicine couldn't understand. 100-hour work weeks, constant sleep deprivation, the pressure of making life and death decisions while barely functioning on 3 hours of sleep. I'd call home during my rare free moments, seeking connection, wanting to share both the triumphs and the struggles of learning to be a physician. My mother would listen patiently, asking questions, offering support. My father's responses were predictable. "When are you going to start making real money?" Or, "Sounds like they're taking advantage of you." Or, "Maybe it's time to consider other options." During my 3rd year of residency, I'd had a particularly difficult case. A 7-year-old girl had come into the emergency department after a bicycle accident. What initially appeared to be minor injuries turned out to be internal bleeding that we caught just in time. I'd worked with the trauma team for 6 hours, helping to stabilize her condition, assisting with surgery, monitoring her recovery. When she was finally out of danger, her parents had hugged me, thanking me through tears for saving their daughter's life. It was one of those moments that reminded me why I'd chosen medicine, why all the sacrifice and struggle was worthwhile. I'd called my parents that night, exhausted but exhilarated, wanting to share the experience. My mother had listened to the entire story, asking about the little girl's condition, expressing amazement at the complexity of the medical intervention. When my father got on the phone, I'd eagerly repeated the story, hoping this time he might understand the significance of what I did, the real impact of my work. "Sounds like you got lucky," he'd said. "What happens when your luck runs out?" That comment had stayed with me for months. It reduced everything I'd learned, all the skill and knowledge I'd acquired, to mere chance. It dismissed the years of training, the careful diagnosis, the teamwork and expertise that had actually saved that little girl's life. According to my father, I was just lucky, and luck wasn't something to be proud of or to build a career on. The pattern extended beyond just my career. When David and I got engaged, my father's first comment was about the expense of the wedding. When we bought our downtown apartment, he criticized the location and the mortgage amount. When I'd mentioned wanting to start a family someday, he'd wondered aloud whether I'd be able to balance motherhood with my hobby career. Every major life decision was met with skepticism, every achievement minimized or explained away. Marcus had taken a different path, and the contrast in treatment was stark. His successes were celebrated, his struggles met with support and encouragement. When his first business venture failed, our parents helped him financially and emotionally, assuring him that failure was part of learning, that he'd bounce back stronger. When he'd wanted to propose to Jennifer but was worried about finances, they'd offered to help with the ring. His accomplishments were family accomplishments, shared victories that brought everyone together. Sitting in that restaurant, watching, my father dismissed my fellowship opportunity as more school. I finally understood that this wasn't about my choices or achievements. This was about something deeper, something that had been present from the beginning, but that I'd been too young and too hopeful to recognize. My father had decided long ago that my path was wrong, that my ambitions were misguided, that my success was somehow threatening or shameful. Nothing I accomplished would ever change that fundamental judgment. The revelation was both devastating and freeing. Devastating because it meant accepting that the approval I'd been seeking my entire life was never going to come. Freeing because it released me from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove myself, trying to earn love and respect that were apparently conditional on me becoming someone I wasn't. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, my father stood up from the table with the deliberate movements of someone whose body had been shaped by decades of physical labor. He stretched, wincing slightly at some chronic pain in his lower back, then reached for his wallet. The gesture was familiar, automatic, the end-of-meal routine we'd performed countless times before. But something about his posture, the set of his shoulders, suggested he wasn't quite finished with the evening's conversation. "Before we go," he said, his voice carrying that tone I recognized from childhood, the one that meant he had something important to say and expected everyone to. "Listen, I want to say something to Claire." My stomach tightened. David's hand found mine under the table, his fingers interlacing with mine in a gesture of support. My mother looked nervous, her eyes darting between my father and me as if she could sense that whatever was coming wouldn't be good. Marcus was helping his kids gather their crayons and coloring pages, but I could see him listening, waiting. "You've been doing this doctor thing for what, 10 years now?" my father continued. "And I've been patient. I've kept my mouth shut while you've spent all this time and money chasing something that doesn't make sense for someone from our family." The phrase, "our family," hung in the air like smoke. It carried the weight of generations, the implication that there were certain paths that people from our background were meant to follow, certain limits that weren't supposed to be exceeded. My great-grandfather had been a logger. My grandfather had worked in the shipyards. My father had moved into construction. Marcus was the first to go to college, but he'd chosen business, something practical, something that translated directly into financial success. I was the anomaly, the one who'd ventured too far from the script. "But enough is enough," he said, his voice growing harder. "You're 32 years old, Claire. You're married to a good man who could support you properly if you'd let him. You could have a normal life, a real family, instead of playing pretend in some hospital where half the time you're probably doing more harm than good." The attack felt different this time, more personal, more comprehensive. It wasn't just about my career anymore. It was about my entire identity, my marriage, my choices about family and lifestyle. He was reducing everything I'd built, everything I valued about my life, to playing pretend. "Medicine isn't pretend, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've spent 12 years learning how to save lives. I've treated thousands of patients, worked with some of the most respected physicians in the country, contributed to medical research that's helping people around the world." "Research," he scoffed. "More books, more theories, more made-up problems for made-up solutions. You want to know what the real problem is? You've convinced yourself that you're better than the rest of us, that your fancy education makes you special. That's not true. I've never thought I was better than anyone." "Haven't you?" His eyes narrowed. "When's the last time you visited your grandmother? When's the last time you came to Marcus's kids' birthday parties? You're always, too busy, always have some important hospital thing that's more important than family." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. My schedule was demanding, and I had missed family events because of work obligations. But the suggestion that this was due to arrogance rather than professional responsibility felt unfair. Emergency medicine didn't operate on a 9-to-5 schedule. Patients didn't stop having heart attacks or car accidents because it was someone's birthday or a holiday. My work saves lives, Dad. Sometimes that has to take priority. Your work, he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. Your important work that nobody outside your little hospital bubble actually needs or understands. You want to know what I think about your work? The question was rhetorical. He was going to tell me regardless of my answer. The restaurant noise seemed to fade around us, other conversations becoming distant murmurs as my father's voice rose slightly, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated resentment. I think you're worthless, he said, the word hitting, like a physical blow. I think you've wasted your life on something that doesn't matter, convinced yourself that you're saving the world when really you're just another overpaid, overrated person who thinks a fancy title makes them important. You're worthless as a daughter, worthless as a family member, and probably worthless as a doctor, too. The word worthless echoed in my head, repeated itself over and over like a broken record. In that moment, surrounded by my family in a crowded restaurant, I felt completely alone. The little girl who had once believed her father could do no wrong, who had trusted his judgment above all others, was hearing him declare that her entire existence had no value. David's grip on my hand tightened. My mother made a small sound of protest, but it was quiet, ineffective. Marcus continued helping his children with their belongings, his silence speaking louder than any words. The weight of my father's declaration settled over the table like a funeral shroud, heavy with finality. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to explain once again why my work mattered, why my choices had value. But before I could speak, the restaurant's atmosphere suddenly shifted. There was a commotion near the entrance, raised voices, someone calling for help. The familiar sound of medical emergency cut through the background noise like a siren. "Someone call 911?" a woman's voice shouted. "He's not breathing." Without thinking, I stood up from the table, my body responding to the emergency before my mind had fully processed what was happening. Years of training had conditioned me to react immediately to signs of medical distress, to prioritize patient care above everything else. The conversation with my father, the word worthless still ringing in my ears, became secondary to the immediate need in front of me. I moved quickly toward the commotion, pushing through the crowd that had gathered around a man who had collapsed near the restaurant's entrance. He was middle-aged, probably in his 60s, his face gray and his breathing labored. His wife was kneeling beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to loosen his tie. Other diners stood around helplessly, unsure of what to do but reluctant to leave. I knelt beside the man, my training taking over automatically. "Sir, can you hear me?" I checked his pulse, assessed his breathing, looked for signs of cardiac distress. His pulse was rapid and irregular, his skin clammy and pale. All the signs pointed to a heart attack, possibly a major one. "I'm a doctor," I said to his wife, my voice calm and authoritative. "What's his name?" "Robert," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Robert Martinez." He said his chest hurt when we were walking in, but then he just collapsed. I began chest compressions, counting under my breath, maintaining the rhythm I'd performed thousands of times in emergency situations. The restaurant had gone quiet except for the sound of my efforts and the woman's quiet sobs. Someone had called 911, and I could hear sirens in the distance, but I knew that every second counted in a situation like this. "Is there an AED in the restaurant?" I called out, not looking up from my patient. Automated external defibrillators were becoming more common in public places, and they could make the difference between life and death in cardiac emergencies. "Behind the bar!" someone shouted back, and I heard footsteps running to retrieve it. I continued compressions, checking for signs of response, monitoring the man's condition while we waited for the paramedics to arrive. This was what I'd trained, for what I'd spent years learning to do effectively. In this moment, all the criticism and doubt faded away. There was only the patient, the emergency, and my ability to help. The AED arrived, and I quickly attached the electrodes, following the device's automated instructions. The machine analyzed the patient's heart rhythm and recommended a shock. I cleared the area, delivered the shock, then resumed compressions. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the man's eyes fluttered open, and his breathing became more regular. The paramedics arrived just as he was regaining consciousness, and I gave them a quick report on his condition and the interventions I'd performed. They took over his care, preparing him for transport to the hospital. But one of the EMTs, a young woman I recognized from previous cases, paused to speak with me. "Nice work, Dr. Thompson," she said. "Clean response, perfect technique. You probably saved his life." As the paramedics wheeled the patient toward the ambulance, his wife grabbed my hand. She was an older Hispanic woman, probably around my mother's age, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was still wet with tears, but she was smiling through them. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much, doctor. You saved my Roberto." I squeezed her hand gently. "He's going to be okay. The paramedics will take good care of him at the hospital." "You don't understand," she continued, her grip on my hand tightening. "You saved him before. Last month, when he had his first heart attack. You were the doctor. In the emergency room. You're Dr. Thompson, right? From Portland General?" The recognition hit me like lightning. Robert Martinez. I remembered him now, a patient who had come into the ER with chest pain that initially seemed minor but that I'd recognized as the early signs of a heart attack. I'd ordered immediate testing, called for a cardiology consult, and caught the problem before it became life-threatening. He'd spent 3 days in the hospital, had a stent placed, and gone home with medications and lifestyle recommendations. "Dr. Thompson," his wife continued, "you told us to watch for warning signs, to come back immediately if he had chest pain or shortness of breath. Because of what you taught us, I knew to bring him to dinner tonight with his medications. Knew to call for help immediately when he started having symptoms. You didn't just save his life tonight. You saved it last month, and you taught us how to save it ourselves." The woman's words washed over me like a warm wave, each sentence carrying weight that I desperately needed to hear. Here was concrete, proof of impact, undeniable evidence that my work mattered, that my knowledge and skill had made a real difference in real people's lives. Not once, but twice. Not just through medical intervention, but through education and empowerment. I turned, back toward my family's table, my heart racing not from the emergency response, but from the significance of what had just happened. My father was standing now, along with the rest of my family, watching the scene unfold. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. For the first time in my memory, he looked uncertain, like the ground beneath his feet had shifted in some fundamental way. Mrs. Martinez was still holding my hand, still talking, praising my competence and professionalism, expressing gratitude that seemed to pour out of her without end. Other diners had overheard her words, and I could see them looking at me with new respect, recognizing that the woman who had just saved a life in their midst was not some random Good Samaritan, but a trained physician who had acted with skill and expertise. As I finally made my way back to our table, my father's earlier words echoed in my mind, but they sounded different now. Worthless. The word that had cut so deeply just minutes before now seemed absurd, almost laughable in light of what had just occurred. I had literally saved a man's life while my father was calling me worthless. The universe's timing was indeed twisted, but perhaps also perfect. My family stood in awkward silence as I approached. David's face was filled with pride and amazement. My mother looked like she was trying not to cry. Marcus seemed stunned, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. And my father, the man who had just declared me worthless, stood speechless, his certainty shaken by the undeniable evidence of his daughter's competence and value. The evening had taken a turn that none of us could have predicted. transforming what had begun as a painful family dinner into something else entirely. The conversation was far from over, but the dynamics had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the defensive daughter trying to justify her choices. I was Dr. Claire Thompson, and I had just reminded everyone, including myself, exactly what that meant. The drive home from the restaurant passed in complete silence. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his jaw set in that way that meant he was processing something significant. I stared out the passenger window at the Portland streets, the familiar neighborhoods blurring past as my mind replayed the evening's events on an endless loop. The weight of my father's words sat heavy in my chest, but they were now competing with something else entirely different, something I wasn't quite ready to name yet. Our apartment felt different when we walked through the door. The same furniture, the same layout, the same framed medical school diploma hanging on the wall near my desk. But something fundamental had shifted. David moved around the kitchen, making tea with the mechanical precision he used when he needed time to think. I sat on our couch, still wearing the navy dress I'd chosen so carefully that morning, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. "That was incredible," David finally said, setting a steaming mug in front of me. His voice carried a mixture of pride and anger that I'd rarely heard before. "What you did tonight, how you handled that emergency, it was amazing to watch. And the way that woman recognized you, thanked you for saving her husband not once but twice." I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat ground me in the present moment. "It was just training," I said automatically, the words that had become my default response to praise over the years. Any emergency physician would have done the same thing. "No," David said firmly, sitting beside me on the couch. "Don't do that. Don't minimize what happened tonight. That man would have died if you hadn't been there. His wife said you taught them how to recognize the warning signs, how to respond appropriately. You didn't just save his life once, you empowered them to save it themselves." The truth of his words settled into my bones slowly, like warmth spreading through cold limbs. For so many years, I'd measured my worth by my father's standards, allowed his definition of value to overshadow my own understanding of my contributions. But tonight had provided something I'd never experienced before: immediate and undeniable validation of my skills and impact from someone whose life I'd directly touched. "Your father," David continued, his voice tight with controlled anger, "called you worthless. Worthless. 20 minutes before you saved a man's life in front of his entire family. The timing is so absurd it's almost funny, except it's not funny at all, because of how much his words hurt you." I set down my tea and leaned back into the couch cushions. "He's always been like this, David. It's not just about tonight. It's been building for years, maybe decades. I keep thinking that if I just achieve enough, if I just prove myself thoroughly enough, he'll finally see what I've accomplished. But tonight made me realize that's never going to happen." "Why?" David asked. "What is it about your success that threatens him so much?" The question hung in the air between us, and I found myself thinking about it seriously for the first time. Why did my father react with such hostility to my achievements? Why did every milestone I reached seem to widen the gap between us rather than bridge it? "I think," I said slowly, "it's because my success challenges everything he believes about worth and value. In his world, real work is physical work. Real contribution is tangible, measurable, immediate. You build a house, you can point to it and say, 'I made that.' You pour concrete, you can see the result. My work is invisible to him because it's intellectual, because it requires education he doesn't have, because it exists in a world he doesn't understand." David nodded, encouraging me to continue. "But it's more than that," I went on, the pieces falling into place as I spoke. "I think my education represents abandonment to him. Every degree I earned, every professional achievement, was evidence that I was moving away from the family, from our background, from the values he'd tried to instill in me. Instead of seeing my success as something that could lift everyone up, he sees it as betrayal. The realization was both illuminating and heartbreaking. My father's criticism wasn't really about my career or my competence. It was about his fear of being left behind, his insecurity about his own worth in comparison to my achievements, his inability to see that loving him and succeeding professionally weren't mutually exclusive. "So what do you do now?" David asked, gently. I considered the question carefully. For 32 years, I'd been trying to win my father's approval, modifying my behavior and choices in subtle ways to avoid his criticism, carrying the weight of his disappointment like a stone in my chest. But tonight had shown me something crucial, that his approval wasn't necessary for my worth to be real and meaningful. "I stopped trying to convince him," I said finally. "I stopped waiting for him to understand or appreciate what I do. I stopped letting his definition of value determine my sense of self-worth." The words felt revolutionary as I spoke them, like declaring independence from a country I'd never chosen to join. For so long, my father's opinion had been the lens through which I viewed my own achievements. His criticism had the power to diminish my pride in major accomplishments. His indifference could make significant milestones feel hollow and meaningless. "That sounds healthy in theory," David said carefully. "But how do you actually do that? How do you stop caring about your father's opinion after a lifetime of seeking his approval?" It was a fair question, and I didn't have a complete answer. But I knew where I wanted to start. "I think I need to remember who I am outside of his judgment," I said. Tonight, when I was working on that patient, I wasn't thinking about my father's opinion of my career. I was just being a doctor, using my skills and training to help someone who needed it. That's who I am. That's what I do. And it has value whether my father recognizes it or not. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to that moment in the restaurant, replaying not my father's cruel words, but the recognition in Mrs. Martinez's eyes, the gratitude in her voice, the tangible evidence of impact that no amount of criticism could diminish. I began to see my career differently, not as something I needed to justify or defend, but as something I could simply inhabit with confidence and pride. At work, I paid attention to moments I might have overlooked before. The teenager whose life I saved after a drug overdose, whose mother hugged me with tears streaming down her face. The elderly man whose heart attack I caught early, whose daughter sent me a card weeks later with photos of him playing with his grandchildren. The young mother whose pregnancy complications I managed, allowing her to carry her baby to term safely. These interactions had always been part of my job, but I'd never fully absorbed their significance. I'd been so focused on my father's definition of worth that I'd missed the daily evidence of my own value and impact. Patients and families thanked me regularly. Colleagues sought my opinion and expertise. Medical students requested to work with me because of my reputation as an excellent teacher and clinician. The fellowship opportunity at Oregon Health Sciences became a symbol of this new perspective. Instead of seeing it as something I needed to justify to my family, I began to view it as recognition of documented excellence, an opportunity to expand my skills and help even more patients in the future. The selection committee hadn't chosen me because they felt sorry for me or because I'd manipulated the system. They'd chosen me because my work over the past several years had demonstrated the competence, dedication, and potential they were looking for. I called Dr. Patricia Kim, the department head who had offered me the fellowship and accepted the position. Her excitement and confidence in my abilities provided another data point in my growing collection of evidence that my father's assessment of my worth was not only wrong, but irrelevant. "You're going to be an excellent cardiac surgeon," Dr. Kim told me during our phone conversation. "Your diagnostic skills are exceptional, your bedside manner with patients is outstanding, and your colleagues consistently praise your collaborative approach and clinical judgment. We're lucky to have you in the program." These were the opinions that mattered. These were the voices of people who actually understood my work, who had observed my performance over time, who had the expertise to evaluate my competence accurately. My father's criticism carried weight only because I'd allowed it to, not because it was based on any legitimate assessment of my abilities or contributions. The shift in perspective wasn't immediate or complete. 32 years of conditioning couldn't be undone in a few days of revelation. But I began to notice small changes in how I moved through the world. I stood a little straighter during hospital rounds. I spoke with more authority during medical consultations. I stopped preemptively apologizing for my success or downplaying my achievements when talking with friends and colleagues. David noticed the changes too. "You seem different," he said, one evening as we were making dinner together. "More confident, more settled somehow." "I feel different," I admitted. "Lighter, maybe. Like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time and finally figured out I could set it down." The conversation with my family wasn't over, of course. My mother called several times during the week following the dinner, her voice careful and concerned. She didn't directly address what had happened at the restaurant, but I could hear her worry in the spaces between her words, her desire to smooth over the conflict without actually addressing its root causes. "Your father has been quiet since Saturday," she said during one of these calls. "I think the whole situation at the restaurant really affected him." I wondered what the whole situation meant from her perspective. Was it my father's cruel declaration that I was worthless? The medical emergency that had interrupted our dinner? The recognition I'd received from Mrs. Martinez? The undeniable demonstration of competence that had followed so closely on the heels of his criticism? "How are you doing, Mom?" I asked, genuinely curious about her experience of the evening. "I'm worried about our family," she said quietly. "I hate seeing this tension between you and your father. I know he loves you, Claire. He's just not good at expressing it, especially when he feels like he doesn't understand your world." It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging that my father's behavior toward me was problematic. She wasn't defending his words or making excuses for his cruelty, but she also wasn't fully holding him accountable. It was a middle ground that probably felt safe to her, but didn't address the fundamental issues in our relationship. "I love him too, Mom," I said, surprised by how true the words felt despite everything. "But love doesn't mean accepting verbal abuse or constantly trying to prove myself to someone who's determined not to see my worth." She was quiet for a long moment. "What does that mean for our family going forward?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been considering carefully. I didn't want to cut my parents out of my life completely, but I also couldn't continue to subject myself to interactions that left me feeling diminished and devalued. I needed to find a way to maintain some kind of relationship while protecting my own emotional well-being. "It means I'm going to set some boundaries," I said. "I'm not going to sit quietly while Dad criticizes my career or calls me worthless. I'm not going to justify my choices or try to convince him that my work has value. I'm going to be polite and respectful, but I'm also going to protect myself from conversations that are designed to tear me down." My mother sighed. "That sounds lonely." "It's lonelier to be surrounded by family who don't see or appreciate who you are," I replied gently. "I'd rather have honest distance than fake closeness." Marcus called later that week, his voice awkward with the unfamiliarity of serious conversation between us. We'd always had a cordial relationship, but we'd rarely discussed anything deeper than work updates and holiday plans. The events at the restaurant had apparently prompted him to reach out in a way that felt unprecedented. "Hey, Claire," he said after the usual pleasantries. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened at Dad's birthday dinner." "Okay," I said, unsure where he was heading with the conversation. "I should have said something," he continued. "When Dad was being so harsh about your career when he called you worthless, I should have spoken up. I should have defended you." The apology was unexpected and more meaningful than I'd anticipated. Marcus had always been the favored child, the one whose success was celebrated rather than criticized, and I'd sometimes resented the ease with which he navigated our family dynamics. But hearing him acknowledge what had happened, taking responsibility for his silence, felt like a step toward a more honest relationship between us. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "It would have meant a lot to have your support in that moment." "I was thinking about it afterward," Marcus went on, "about how different our experiences in the family have been. Dad has always been proud of what I do, always supportive of my choices. I never really noticed how differently he treated your achievements until I saw it so clearly that night." "It's been going on for years," I said. "Since high school, really. Maybe earlier." I'm sorry I didn't see it before. I'm sorry I didn't say anything when I should have." The conversation felt like a gift, acknowledgement and validation from someone who had witnessed our family dynamics firsthand. Marcus couldn't change the past, but his recognition of the problem felt like a foundation for a different kind of relationship going forward. "What you did that night," he added, "saving that man's life, having his wife recognize you and thank you for saving him before, it was incredible to watch. I was proud to be your brother." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. Throughout our childhood and adulthood, I'd wanted Marcus to see me, to recognize my achievements, to be proud of our connection. Hearing him express those feelings, directly, prompted by witnessing my competence in action rather than just hearing about it secondhand, felt profoundly healing. "I've accepted the cardiac surgery fellowship," I told him. 2 more years of training, but after that, I'll be qualified to perform complex heart surgeries." "That's amazing, Claire. Seriously, I'm so proud of you. And I think what you're doing is incredibly important, even if Dad doesn't understand it." The fellowship program began 6 weeks later, and I threw myself into the additional training with renewed energy and purpose. The work was demanding, requiring even longer hours and more intensive study than my residency had involved, but I approached it with a clarity of mission that had been missing before. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone except myself and my patients. I was learning to save lives in new ways, acquiring skills that would allow me to help people facing the most serious cardiac emergencies and conditions. Dr. Sarah Chen, the program director, was a brilliant surgeon whose reputation extended far beyond Portland. She was known not just for her technical expertise, but for her ability to teach complex procedures and her commitment to advancing the field through research and innovation. Working with her was like getting a masterclass in excellence, and I found myself rising to meet the high standards she set for all her fellows. "You have excellent hands," she told me after observing me assist with my first major cardiac surgery. "Steady, precise, confident. But more importantly, you have good judgment. You anticipate problems. You think ahead. You make decisions quickly and accurately under pressure. Those qualities can't be taught. They're part of who you are as a physician." The praise felt different from the recognition I'd received in the past. Instead of feeling grateful for the acknowledgement, I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my skills were being accurately assessed and appreciated by someone whose opinion carried real weight in the medical community. This was peer recognition, professional validation based on observed competence rather than sympathy or politeness. The other fellows in the program were impressive, accomplished physicians from prestigious residency programs around the country. Working alongside them challenged me to perform at my highest level, but I found that I could hold my own in that company. My background in emergency medicine had given me skills and perspectives that complemented my new cardiac surgery training in valuable ways. 6 months into the fellowship, I was selected to present a case study at the American College of Cardiology's annual conference. The presentation involved a complex patient case where I'd played a key role in diagnosis and treatment planning, and the selection was based on the innovative approach we'd used and the excellent patient outcome we'd achieved. It was an honor typically reserved for senior physicians, And Dr. Chen made it clear that my selection reflected her confidence in my abilities and potential. Standing on that conference stage in front of hundreds of cardiac specialists from around the world, presenting research and clinical insights to peers who were leaders in the field, I felt a sense of professional identity that was completely separate from my family relationships. This was who I was as a physician. This was the impact of my work. This was the contribution I was making to medicine and to the patients whose lives were improved by advances in cardiac care. After my presentation, several attendees approached me with questions and compliments. Department heads from other hospitals expressed interest in my future career plans. Researchers wanted to discuss potential collaborations. Medical device. Companies sought my input on new technologies they were developing. The recognition was based purely on my demonstrated expertise and the quality of my work, completely independent of anyone else's opinion or approval. Flying home from the conference, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with my family dynamics. I was Dr. Claire Thompson, cardiac surgery fellow, respected member of the medical community, physician whose work was making a difference in patients' lives and advancing the field of medicine. That identity was solid, real, and completely my own. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was profound. I stopped seeking my father's approval not through anger or rebellion, but through the simple recognition that I didn't need it. His opinion of my work was irrelevant to its actual value, just as his inability to see my worth didn't diminish my contribution to the world. I was finally free from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove myself to someone who had decided long ago that my path was wrong. The freedom was intoxicating. Without the constant background anxiety about my father's disapproval, I found that I had more energy for everything else in my life. My relationships with colleagues deepened because I wasn't constantly second-guessing myself or apologizing for my success. My marriage to David grew stronger because I was no longer bringing the stress and insecurity from family interactions into our home. Even my patient care improved because I was fully present and confident in my abilities, rather than distracted by doubts about my competence. For the first time in my adult life, I was living entirely for my own reasons, pursuing goals that aligned with my values and interests rather than trying to satisfy someone else's expectations. It was a kind of freedom I hadn't known was possible, and it changed everything about how I moved through the world. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, just as David and I were settling down to dinner. The caller ID showed my mother's number, but something about the timing felt urgent. Mom rarely called during dinner hours unless something was genuinely wrong. I answered on the third ring, already bracing myself for bad news. "Claire, honey." Her voice was shaky, strained in a way I'd rarely heard before. "It's your father. He's in the hospital." My stomach dropped immediately, despite everything that had transpired between us over the past year. What happened? He collapsed at the job site this afternoon. Chest pains, difficulty breathing. They rushed him to Providence, Portland, and the doctors are saying it's a heart attack. A serious one. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father, who had spent years dismissing my medical expertise, was now facing the exact type of emergency I'd trained my entire career to handle. Providence, Portland wasn't my hospital, but I knew the cardiac team there, had worked with several of their physicians during my fellowship rotations. "How is he now?" I asked, already reaching for my keys and jacket. "Stable," they said, but they're keeping him in the cardiac intensive care unit. "Claire, he's been asking for you." That stopped me cold. In all the months since his birthday dinner, since he'd called me worthless in front of our entire family, we'd barely spoken. I'd maintained polite distance at family gatherings, exchanging pleasantries but avoiding any substantial conversation. He'd made no effort to apologize or acknowledge what had happened between us. The idea that he was asking for me now felt surreal. "He's asking for me specifically?" "Yes, sweetheart. He keeps saying he needs to talk to you. The nurses said." "He's been agitated about it. Worried that you won't come because of everything that happened." David was already getting his coat, having heard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. Despite the complicated family dynamics, there was no question that we would go to the hospital immediately. Whatever issues existed between my father and me, I couldn't ignore a medical emergency. The drive to Providence, Portland took 20 minutes through evening traffic, long enough for me to mentally prepare for what we might find. Heart attacks in men my father's age could be devastating, particularly if he'd delayed seeking treatment, or if there had been complications. His physical condition had always seemed robust, built by decades of manual labor, but I knew that didn't necessarily protect against cardiac events. We found my mother in the cardiac ICU waiting area, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. She'd aged in the month since the birthday dinner, stress lines deeper around her eyes, her posture showing the weight of worry and exhaustion. Marcus was there too, along with Jennifer and their kids, creating a small family cluster in the sterile hospital environment. "How is he?" I asked, settling into the chair beside my mother. The cardiologist explained everything, but honestly, it was hard to follow all the medical terms. Something about blockages and interventions. They did some kind of procedure earlier, putting in stents, I think. I nodded, familiar with the process. That's good. If they were able to place stents, it means they caught the blockage before too much damage occurred to the heart muscle. What did the doctor say about his prognosis? That it was touch and go for a while, but he's responding well to treatment. They want to keep him here for several days, monitor his progress, make sure there aren't complications. A nurse approached our group, checking her tablet. "Are you Claire Thompson? Dr. Claire Thompson?" "Yes, that's me. Your father has been asking for you repeatedly. He's awake and alert now, if you'd like to see him. I should warn you, he's still on several medications and might seem a bit disoriented, but he's been very insistent about speaking with you." I followed the nurse through the ICU doors, past rooms filled with critically ill patients connected to monitors and machines that I recognized from my own training. The cardiac ICU was a place I'd spent countless hours during my residency and fellowship, but being there as a family member rather than a physician felt entirely different. My father looked diminished in the hospital bed, his usual commanding presence reduced by medical equipment and the vulnerability of serious illness. His face was pale, lacking the ruddy complexion that came from years of outdoor work. Electrodes were attached to his chest, an IV line ran to his arm, and oxygen cannulas rested beneath his nose. But his eyes were alert, and they tracked to me immediately as I entered the room. "Claire," he said, his voice hoarse but urgent. "You came." "Of course I came, Dad. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he admitted, attempting a weak smile. "But the doctors say I'm going to be okay. They keep talking about stents and medications and lifestyle changes. All this medical stuff I don't understand." I pulled a chair close to his bedside, noting the various monitors and their readings automatically. His vital signs looked stable, consistent with someone recovering from cardiac intervention. The nursing staff had clearly been attentive, and his room showed evidence of excellent care. "The stents are small devices that keep your arteries open," I explained gently. "They placed them where you had blockages, allowing blood to flow normally to your heart muscle again. It's a very effective treatment, and your numbers look good." He studied my face intently. "You understand all this, don't you? All these machines, the procedures, what the doctors are saying." "Yes, Dad. Cardiac emergencies are part of what I treat regularly. Heart attacks, arrhythmias, post-surgical complications. It's been a major focus of my training." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that seemed to penetrate beyond the medications and the stress of his medical crisis. "You save people like me." "People exactly like you," I confirmed. "Construction workers, fathers, men who've worked hard their entire lives and suddenly face cardiac emergencies. I've treated hundreds of patients with conditions very similar to yours." He was quiet for several minutes, his breathing steady, but his eyes distant. I could see him processing information, connecting dots that had apparently never aligned for him before. The abstract concept of my medical career was suddenly concrete, personal, relevant to his own immediate experience. "The cardiologist who did my procedure," he said finally. "Dr. Williams, he mentioned your name when he heard you were my daughter. Said you were one of the finest emergency physicians he'd worked with, that he'd trust you with his own family's care." I was surprised to hear this, though I knew Dr. Williams by reputation and had collaborated with him on several cases during my fellowship. It was typical of the medical community's interconnectedness that he would know my work, but I hadn't expected him to mention it to my father. "He said you probably knew more about cardiac emergencies than half the cardiologists he works with," my father continued. "Said your diagnostic skills were exceptional, that you'd caught things other doctors missed." The praise felt strange coming through my father's voice, filtered through his experience as a patient rather than delivered directly to me as a colleague. But I could see that hearing it from his own physician, someone whose expertise he was currently dependent on, had created a new context for understanding my professional abilities. "Dr. Williams is being generous," I said. "But yes, cardiac emergencies are something I've specialized in. It's why I pursued the additional fellowship training. The nurse mentioned you were in a special program, some kind of advanced training for heart surgery." Cardiac surgery fellowship. I'm learning to perform complex heart operations, not just diagnose and treat cardiac emergencies in the emergency department. It's additional specialization beyond what most emergency physicians pursue. He nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "So you could do what Dr. Williams did for me? The stent procedure?" "With the fellowship training, yes. Though Dr. Williams is an interventional cardiologist, so that's his specific expertise. I'm training more broadly in cardiac surgery, which includes procedures like bypass surgery, valve repairs, more complex interventions." The conversation felt surreal. For the first time in my adult life, my father was asking genuine questions about my work, seeking to understand rather than dismiss or minimize. His medical crisis had created a context where my expertise was personally relevant, where the abstract concept of playing doctor had become concrete life-saving skill. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice growing more serious. "About what I said at my birthday dinner, about calling you worthless." I felt my chest tighten. I'd assumed this conversation would come eventually, but I wasn't sure. I was ready for it in this setting, with him vulnerable in a hospital bed, dependent on the very medical system I was part of. "Dad, you don't need to do this now. You should focus on getting better." "No, I do need to do this. Lying here, thinking I might die, thinking about what my last words to you were, it's been eating at me." He paused, struggling with words. In a way I'd never seen from him before. I was wrong. Completely, totally wrong. The apology hung in the air between us, carrying weight that years of conflict had built up. But it felt complicated, tied to his current vulnerability and dependence on medical care, rather than arising from genuine understanding of what he'd done wrong. "What changed your mind?" I asked carefully. "Being here, seeing what doctors actually do. Understanding that my life was saved by people who do exactly what you do." When Dr. Williams was explaining my condition, talking about the risks, the procedures, the ongoing care I'll need, I realized how much skill and knowledge it takes, how much training, how much responsibility. He shifted in the bed, wincing, slightly at some discomfort. "And then when he mentioned knowing you, when he talked about your reputation, it hit me that you're not just playing at being important. You actually are important. You save lives. You make decisions that determine whether people live or die. That's real work, more real than anything I've ever done." The recognition felt hollow somehow, contingent on his personal experience rather, than based on genuine respect for my choices and achievements. He was seeing my worth now because it had become relevant to his own situation, not because he'd gained broader understanding of medicine's value or my competence. "I appreciate the apology, Dad," I said slowly. "But I need you to understand something. My work had value before your heart attack, and it would have value even if you never needed medical care. The worth of what I do isn't dependent on whether it directly benefits our family." He looked taken aback by my response, perhaps expecting gratitude for his admission of error rather than continued confrontation about the underlying issues. "I know that," he said, though his tone suggested he was still grappling with the concept. "I guess I just never really understood before." "That's part of the problem," I continued, feeling the need to address this honestly now that the conversation had opened. "You never tried to understand. For years, you dismissed my career without making any effort to learn what it actually involved. You called it playing pretend, said it wasn't real work, suggested I was wasting my life, all without ever asking questions or showing genuine interest in what I actually do." The cardiac monitor beeped steadily in the background, a reminder of the medical intervention that had saved his life, performed by physicians who had trained the way I had trained, who had developed expertise through the same educational path he'd spent years criticizing. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I made assumptions. I let my own insecurities about education and professional success color how I saw your choices." This was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging the underlying dynamics that had shaped our relationship. His discomfort with my educational achievements, his feeling of being left behind or diminished by my professional success, had manifested as criticism and dismissal rather than pride and support. "I need you to know," I said, "that calling me worthless wasn't just hurtful in the moment. It was the culmination of years of feeling like my achievements didn't matter to you, like my success was somehow shameful or wrong. It wasn't just one cruel comment. It was confirmation of messages you'd been sending my entire adult life." He closed his eyes, and I could see him processing the weight of what I was saying. The medication was making him more emotional than usual, but I thought the tears gathering in his eyes were genuine rather than pharmaceutical. "I'm sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry for all of it. You deserved better from me. You deserved a father who celebrated your success instead of resenting it." The apology felt more complete this time, acknowledging the pattern rather than just the specific incident. But I found myself hesitant to accept it completely, uncertain whether his perspective had truly changed or whether his medical crisis had simply made him temporarily more receptive to recognizing my professional value. "Where do we go from here?" I asked. "I want to learn," he said. "I want to understand what you do, what your training involved, what kinds of patients you treat. I want to be proud of you the way I should have been all along." The offer felt genuine, but I was cautious about how much to invest in his newfound interest. Crisis-induced revelations didn't always translate into lasting change, and I'd been hurt too many times by his criticism to immediately trust his conversion. "That would mean a lot to me," I said carefully. "But it has to be real, Dad. Not just because you're currently dependent on medical care, but because you genuinely want to understand and support what I've chosen to do with my life." "I understand," he said, "and I know I have a lot to make up for. Years of not being the father you deserved." Over the following days, as my father's condition stabilized and he began his recovery, I found myself spending more time at the hospital than I'd expected. Partly this was because his medical team, knowing I was a physician, included me in discussions about his care and ongoing treatment plan. But partly it was because I was curious to see whether his apparent change of heart would persist beyond the immediate crisis. He did seem genuinely interested in learning about his condition and treatment. He asked detailed questions about his medications, wanted to understand the lifestyle changes he'd need to make, sought my opinion on his doctor's recommendations. But more surprisingly, He began asking about my own work, requesting stories about interesting cases, wanting to understand the challenges and rewards of emergency medicine. "Tell me about the hardest case you've handled," he said during one of my visits. I thought for a moment, then described a multi-trauma case from earlier in my fellowship, a construction accident involving multiple workers who had been brought to our emergency department simultaneously. The complexity of triaging multiple critical patients, coordinating with various specialists, managing families' fears and questions, had tested every aspect of my training. He listened intently, asking questions about medical procedures and decision-making processes that showed he was genuinely trying to understand, rather than just making conversation. When I finished the story, he was quiet for several minutes. "That's incredible responsibility," he said finally. "All those lives depending on your decisions, your skills. How do you handle that kind of pressure?" "Training helps," I said. "But honestly, you just do what needs to be done. You focus on the next step, the next decision, the next patient. You can't let yourself think about the bigger picture while you're in the middle of it, or the pressure would be paralyzing." "I never realized," he said. "I thought doctors just followed protocols, but you're describing split-second decisions that could determine whether someone lives or dies." The conversation felt like a breakthrough, the first time he'd engaged seriously with the realities of my profession, rather than dismissing them based on preconceptions. But I remained cautious about reading too much into his newfound interest, knowing that hospital environments could create artificial intimacy and understanding that didn't necessarily translate to normal life. Dr. Williams stopped by during one of my visits, and I had the opportunity to observe his interaction with my father firsthand. The respect in my father's voice when speaking to the cardiologist was obvious, the deference he showed to medical expertise that he'd never demonstrated toward my own professional knowledge. "Your daughter has been invaluable in helping you understand your treatment plan," Dr. Williams told him. "She's been able to translate the medical terminology, help you understand the implications of various options. It's wonderful to have a physician in the family during situations like this." I watched my father's reaction to this comment, saw him processing the idea that I could serve as medical translator and advocate, that my expertise could benefit our family directly. It was another piece of concrete evidence that my professional knowledge had practical value, even for people who thought medicine was abstract or irrelevant. As his hospital stay progressed, I noticed other changes in how my father interacted with medical staff. He was more respectful, more appreciative, more willing to follow recommendations. His brush with mortality had apparently given him new perspective on the value of medical expertise and the dedication required to provide quality health care. "The nurses work so hard," he told me one afternoon. "They're here all night, checking on everyone, managing all these complex patients. I never thought about what it takes to keep a place like this running." The comment revealed how narrow his previous understanding of healthcare had been. He'd seen only the end results, the bills and the brief interactions with physicians, without recognizing the enormous infrastructure of knowledge, training, and dedication that made modern medicine possible. Marcus visited regularly, and I noticed that the conversations between him and our father had shifted too. Instead of focusing only on business and financial success, they talked about health, family priorities, the importance of work-life balance. My father's cardiac event had apparently triggered broader reflection about values and goals. "I've been thinking about what really matters," my father told Marcus during one visit I witnessed. "Building houses is important, but it's not more important than spending time with family or taking care of your health." I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way. The revelation felt significant, an acknowledgement that his previous hierarchy of values might have been misguided. If physical work wasn't inherently more valuable than other kinds of contribution, if professional success needed to be balanced against personal relationships and well-being, then perhaps his criticism of my career choices had been based on flawed premises. By the time he was discharged from the hospital, my father seemed genuinely transformed by the experience. His follow-up care plan included cardiac rehabilitation, dietary changes, medication management, and regular monitoring, all of which he approached with seriousness and commitment that surprised everyone in our family. "I want to live to see my grandchildren grow up," he told me as we discussed his treatment plan. "I want to be around for your achievements, your successes. I've missed too much already because of my own stubbornness." The statement felt like a promise, a commitment to being present and supportive in ways he hadn't been before. But I knew that real change would need to be demonstrated over time, through consistent behavior rather than crisis-induced declarations. The first test came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after his discharge, I received notification that my presentation at the American College of Cardiology conference had been selected for publication in the journal's prestigious research section. It was a significant honor, the kind of professional recognition that established credibility within the medical community and opened doors for future opportunities. I called my parents to share the news, expecting polite congratulations but not much engagement with the specifics. Instead, my father asked detailed questions about the research, the peer review process, the significance of publication in that particular journal. "This is a big deal, isn't it?" he said. "Having your work published in a national medical journal?" "Yes, it's quite an honor," I confirmed. "The research will reach thousands of cardiologists and cardiac surgeons around the world. It could influence treatment protocols and patient care in hospitals everywhere. So your work, your research, could help save lives in places you've never been, for patients you'll never meet?" "That's exactly right. That's one of the ways medical knowledge advances, through research and publication that allows physicians to learn from each other's experiences and innovations." He was quiet for a moment, processing this broader perspective on medical impact. "I'm proud of you, Claire. Really proud. This is incredible achievement." The words I'd been waiting to hear my entire adult life, delivered with genuine understanding and appreciation rather than obligation or guilt. They felt different than I'd imagined they would, more meaningful because they came from genuine comprehension of what I'd accomplished rather than generic parental pride. Over the following months, my father's transformation proved to be lasting. He attended my fellowship graduation ceremony, where he listened attentively to the speakers and asked informed questions about the program requirements and future opportunities. He bragged to neighbors and coworkers about my achievements, sharing details about my research and clinical work with the same enthusiasm he'd previously reserved for Marcus's business successes. The change in our relationship felt profound, but also bittersweet. I was grateful for his recognition and support, but I couldn't entirely forget the years of criticism and dismissal that had preceded this conversion. The little girl who had desperately wanted her father's approval had finally received it, but the adult woman who had learned to value herself independently didn't need it in the same way. Our new dynamic was healthier, more honest, built on mutual respect rather than my constant attempts to earn approval. He stopped making disparaging comments about education and professional achievement. I stopped trying to justify my choices or prove my worth through increasingly impressive accomplishments. We found common ground in family concerns, shared interests, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The Cardiac Surgery Fellowship concluded with offers from several prestigious hospitals, opportunities to continue my training at the highest levels of the profession. I chose a position at Oregon Health Sciences University, allowing me to stay in Portland while pursuing subspecialty training in pediatric cardiac surgery. The decision meant I could maintain my relationship with my family while building the career I'd always envisioned. My father attended the ceremony where I was officially appointed to the pediatric cardiac surgery program, and I watched him beam with pride as my achievements were recognized by medical colleagues and administrators. The man who had once called me worthless was now one of my strongest supporters, someone who understood and celebrated the significance of what I'd accomplished. The transformation wasn't just about our relationship, though that was certainly important. It was about my own journey towards self-respect and professional confidence, my ability to define my worth based on actual contribution rather than others' recognition or approval. The little girl who had needed her father's validation had grown into a woman who knew her value independently, who could appreciate his support without depending on it for her sense of self-worth. Standing in that hospital auditorium, surrounded by medical colleagues and family members, I felt the profound satisfaction of having built a career that aligned with my values and abilities, regardless of whether anyone else understood or appreciated it. The recognition from my father was wonderful, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of professional identity or personal worth. I was Dr. Claire Thompson, pediatric cardiac surgeon, someone who saved children's lives and advanced medical knowledge through research and clinical innovation. That identity was solid, meaningful, and entirely my own, built through years of training, dedication, and service to patients and families who needed the expertise I'd worked so hard to develop. The journey from worthless daughter to respected physician had been longer and more difficult than I'd ever anticipated, but it had taught me lessons about resilience, self-respect, and the importance of defining success on my own terms rather than seeking approval from people who might never be capable of understanding or appreciating my choices. In the end, that was perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. That worth isn't determined by others' recognition, but by the integrity and impact of the work itself, by the lives touched and improved through professional dedication and skill. My father's eventual recognition was gratifying, but my sense of professional identity and personal value had become independent of his or anyone else's approval, grounded instead in the concrete reality of lives saved, knowledge advanced, and service provided to those who needed it most. 2 years later, I stood in the pediatric cardiac surgery suite at Oregon Health Sciences University, my gloved hands steady as I prepared for one of the most complex operations of my career. The patient was a 4-year-old girl named Sophia Martinez, born with a rare congenital heart defect that required intricate surgical repair. Her parents waited in the family lounge, their faces etched with the particular kind of terror that comes when your child's life hangs in the balance. The irony of the surname wasn't lost on me. Martinez had become a name that carried special significance in my life, connected to moments of professional validation and personal transformation. But today, the focus was entirely on this little girl whose heart needed precise reconstruction to give her a normal childhood and a full life ahead. "Dr. Thompson, we're ready to begin," announced Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the perfusionist who would manage the heart-lung machine during the procedure. Around me, a team of highly trained professionals prepared for the delicate work ahead. Pediatric cardiac surgery required not just technical skill, but an almost artistic precision, working with structures so small that every millimeter mattered. As we began the operation, I felt the familiar calm that came with complex medical procedures. This was where all my training converged, where years of study and practice translated into life-saving action. The tiny heart in front of me represented both incredible fragility and remarkable resilience, capable of healing and adapting if given the chance through skilled intervention. The surgery took 6 hours. We repaired the septal defect, reconstructed the malformed valve, and restored normal blood flow through chambers that were smaller than my thumb. Every step required absolute concentration, but I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The little girl whose father had once called her worthless was now responsible for giving another little girl the chance at a healthy life. When we finally closed Sophia's chest and transferred her to the pediatric cardiac intensive care unit, her vital signs were strong and stable. The repair looked perfect on the echocardiogram, her heart rhythm steady and normal. In a few days, she would wake up to a completely different future than the one she'd faced before surgery. I found her parents in the waiting area, exhausted from hours of anxious anticipation. Her mother, Elena Martinez, looked up hopefully as I approached, searching my face for any sign of how the surgery had gone. Sophia did beautifully, I told them, settling into the chair beside them. The repair went exactly as planned. Her heart is functioning normally, and we expect a complete recovery. Elena burst into tears, her husband Roberto wrapping his arms around her as they absorbed the news. These were the moments that made every sacrifice worthwhile, every difficult year of training meaningful. Watching parents realize their child would live, would thrive, would have the normal childhood they'd feared was impossible. "Thank you," Roberto said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving us our daughter back." As I walked through the hospital corridors afterward, still wearing my surgical scrubs, I reflected on how much had changed since that evening. At my father's birthday dinner, the woman who had sat silently while being called worthless had become someone who routinely performed miracles, whose hands and knowledge regularly restored health and hope to families facing their darkest moments. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. How did the Martinez surgery go? Even after all these years together, he still tracked my major cases, understanding their significance in ways that demonstrated his deep knowledge of my work and his genuine investment in my success. "Perfect outcome," I texted back. "Sophia's going to be fine." His response came immediately. "So proud of you. Can't wait to hear all about it tonight." The support felt wonderful, but what struck me most was that it wasn't necessary for my sense of accomplishment. The successful surgery was meaningful because of its impact on Sophia and her family, because of the technical challenges overcome, and the life improved. External recognition was nice, but my professional satisfaction came from the work itself. That evening, David and I had dinner with my parents, a monthly tradition that had developed since my father's heart attack and recovery. These meals had become something I genuinely looked forward to. Opportunities for real connection rather than the tense encounters of my earlier adult years. "How's the little girl from today's surgery?" my mother asked as we settled at the table. She'd learned to ask specific questions about my work, showing genuine interest in the patients and procedures that filled my days. "She's doing wonderfully," I said. "The surgery went exactly as planned. In a few weeks, she'll be running around like any other 4-year-old with no restrictions on her activity." My father leaned forward, his expression intent. "What exactly was wrong with her heart originally?" I explained the congenital defect, the surgical repair process, the long-term prognosis for children who underwent this type of intervention. He listened carefully, asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand the complexity of what I'd accomplished. "So, without the surgery, what would have happened to her?" he asked. "She would have faced progressive heart failure, multiple hospitalizations, significant activity restrictions, and likely wouldn't have lived to see her teenage years," I explained honestly. The weight of that statement settled over the table. My father was quiet for several moments, processing the reality that my day's work had literally saved a child's life, given her parents their daughter back, restored a family's future. "That's incredible, Claire," he said finally. "To have that kind of skill, that level of responsibility, to make that kind of difference in someone's life. I can't imagine how that feels." "It feels like the most meaningful work I could possibly do," I replied honestly. "Every case is different. Every patient presents unique challenges, but the opportunity to use specialized knowledge and skills to restore health and hope never gets old." Marcus joined us for dessert, bringing updates about his own work and family life. The dynamic between us had evolved too, becoming more balanced and mutually supportive. He'd started referring patients to me when his real estate clients mentioned family members with cardiac issues, proudly telling them about his sister who was one of the city's top pediatric cardiac surgeons. "Actually," Marcus said, "I wanted to tell you about something that happened this week. I was showing a house to a family, and they mentioned their son had heart surgery at OHSU last year. When I told them my sister worked there, they asked what department, and it turns out you were their surgeon. They couldn't stop talking about how amazing you were, how you explained everything, how confident they felt with you taking care of their child. The story warmed my heart. Another piece of evidence that my work extended beyond the technical aspects of surgery into the human elements of care, communication, and family support. Those components had always been important to me, but hearing about their impact from an outside perspective felt particularly meaningful. "That's wonderful feedback," my mother said. "It must be so rewarding to know that families feel that way about the care you provide." "It really is," I agreed. "The technical skills are crucial, but helping families navigate one of the most frightening experiences of their lives is equally important. These parents are trusting me with their child's life. That trust deserves the highest level of both medical expertise and compassionate communication." After dinner, my father asked if I had time to look at some information his cardiologist had given him about new treatment options for his ongoing cardiac care. We sat together at the kitchen table while I reviewed the medical literature, explaining the research behind various approaches, helping him understand the benefits and risks of different choices. "You know," he said as we finished reviewing, "the materials. I keep thinking about how differently things could have gone if you hadn't become a doctor. Not just for me, but for all the patients you've treated over the years. All those families who might have had different outcomes if you'd listened to my criticism and chosen a different path." The observation was profound, acknowledging not just the value of my individual career, but the broader implications of supporting, rather than discouraging, young people's professional aspirations. How many potential doctors, teachers, scientists, or other professionals had been deterred by well-meaning but misguided family pressure to choose more conventional paths? "I think about that too," I admitted. "Not just about my own patients, but about other young women who might be facing the same kind of family resistance to pursuing careers in medicine or other demanding fields. Representation matters. When girls see women in leadership positions in medicine, it expands their sense of what's possible." "Are you involved in mentoring?" my mother asked. "Yes, I work with medical students and residents regularly, but I've also started volunteering with a program that introduces high school girls to careers in medicine. We do hospital tours, let them observe procedures, connect them with physicians in different specialties." My father's expression brightened. "That sounds like important work. Helping young people understand their options, see what's possible if they're willing to pursue it." The enthusiasm in his voice reflected how completely his perspective had shifted. The man who had once criticized my educational pursuits was now advocating for programs that encouraged other young people to follow similar paths. The transformation was remarkable and deeply gratifying. Several months later, I received an invitation that represented the pinnacle of professional recognition in my field. The American Association for Thoracic Surgery had selected me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference, an honor typically reserved for the most distinguished senior physicians in the specialty. At 35, I was among the youngest surgeons ever chosen for this role. The invitation came with a request to speak about innovation in pediatric cardiac surgery, focusing on novel techniques and approaches that were improving outcomes for children with complex congenital heart defects. It was an opportunity to share research and clinical insights with thousands of cardiac surgeons from around the world, potentially influencing treatment protocols and patient care on a global scale. When I called my parents to share the news, my father's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "That's incredible, Claire. What an honor. You'll be speaking to the top heart surgeons in the world?" "That's right. It's considered one of the most prestigious platforms in cardiac surgery. The research I'll be presenting could influence how these procedures are performed at children's hospitals everywhere." "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "To think that your work, your research, your innovations could help save children's lives all over the world. That's legacy-level impact." The recognition from my father felt wonderful, but what struck me most was how secure I felt in my professional identity regardless of his reaction. His pride was gratifying, but it wasn't necessary for my sense of accomplishment or self-worth. I'd become someone who drew professional satisfaction from the work itself, from the impact on patients and families, from the advancement of medical knowledge and practice. Preparing for the keynote presentation required months of research compilation, data analysis, and presentation development. I worked with colleagues from multiple institutions, incorporating insights from dozens of complex cases, synthesizing years of clinical experience into actionable recommendations for the broader cardiac surgery community. The process reminded me of why I'd chosen academic medicine over purely clinical practice. The opportunity to contribute to medical knowledge, to share innovations that could improve patient care beyond my own operating room, represented the highest expression of professional purpose. Every challenging case, every technical innovation, every research insight could potentially benefit children and families I would never meet. David helped me rehearse the presentation, asking questions from the perspective of someone outside medicine, ensuring that my explanations were clear and compelling even for audience members who might not be familiar with the specific procedures I was discussing. "You're going to change how these surgeries are performed," he said after one of our practice sessions. "Your techniques, your approaches, they're going to become standard practice at children's hospitals around the world." The prospect was both thrilling and humbling. The little girl who had once been told she was worthless was now positioned to influence global medical practice, to improve outcomes for thousands of children through research and innovation that had grown from years of dedicated study and clinical practice. The conference took place in Chicago, with over 3,000 cardiac surgeons in attendance. Walking onto that stage, looking out at an audience of the world's leading experts in my field, I felt a profound sense of completion. This was what I'd been building toward throughout my entire career, the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to medical knowledge and practice at the highest levels. My presentation focused on minimally invasive approaches to complex congenital heart repairs, techniques that reduced surgical trauma while improving long-term outcomes for pediatric patients. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with colleagues from major medical centers expressing interest in implementing the approaches I'd described. During the question and answer session, a surgeon from Johns Hopkins asked about training requirements for the techniques I'd presented. Another from Boston Children's Hospital inquired about research collaborations. A physician from Great Ormond Street Hospital in London wanted to discuss international partnerships for advancing pediatric cardiac care. Standing on that stage, fielding questions from the world's most respected cardiac surgeons, I realized that the validation I'd once sought from my father had become irrelevant compared to the recognition I was receiving from true peers, people who understood the complexity and significance of the work at the deepest levels. After the presentation, dozens of colleagues approached me with congratulations, collaboration proposals, and invitations to speak at their institutions. The networking conversations extended late into the evening, with discussions about research, partnerships, clinical innovations, and opportunities to advance pediatric cardiac surgery through shared expertise and resources. Flying home from Chicago, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point. The path from dismissed daughter to internationally recognized surgeon had been longer and more difficult than I'd ever anticipated, but it had taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, self-respect, and the importance of defining success on my own terms. My phone contained dozens of messages from colleagues, family members, and friends who had watched the live stream of my presentation. David had texted multiple times throughout the day, sharing his pride and excitement. Marcus had sent screenshots of social media posts from medical professionals praising my work. My mother had left a voicemail expressing her amazement at seeing me command such respect from the medical community. But the message that moved me most came from my father. "Watched every minute of your presentation. You were magnificent. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what everyone else already knew. that you're extraordinary at what you do. Love you, Dad. The apology felt complete this time, acknowledging not just past mistakes, but the broader failure to recognize and support my abilities from the beginning. More importantly, it came from someone who now genuinely understood the significance of what I'd accomplished, rather than offering generic parental pride. However, what struck me most about receiving his message was that while it felt wonderful, it wasn't necessary for my sense of professional identity or personal worth. The woman who had once desperately needed her father's approval had become someone who drew satisfaction and validation from the work itself, from the patients helped, and the knowledge advanced through dedicated professional practice. Landing. In Portland, returning to my life and my work, I felt profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The criticism and dismissal I'd faced had been painful, but they'd also strengthened my determination and clarified my sense of purpose. The validation I'd eventually received from my family was meaningful, but it wasn't essential for my professional confidence or personal fulfillment. I was Dr. Claire Thompson, pediatric cardiac surgeon, researcher, educator, and advocate for young women pursuing careers in medicine. That identity was solid, meaningful, and entirely my own, built through years of training, dedication, and service to patients and families who needed the expertise I'd worked so hard to develop. The little girl who had once been called worthless had become a woman whose work literally saved lives, whose research influenced global medical practice, whose mentorship helped other young women pursue their own professional dreams. The transformation was complete, not because I'd finally received my father's approval, but because I'd learned to value myself independently, to find meaning and satisfaction in work well done, rather than in others' recognition or praise. The end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. That worth comes from contribution rather than recognition, from impact rather than approval, from the integrity and significance of the work itself rather than from others' ability to understand or appreciate it. My father's eventual recognition had been gratifying, but my sense of professional identity and personal value had become independent of his or anyone else's validation, grounded instead in the concrete reality of lives saved, knowledge advanced, and service provided to those who needed it most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.